Welcome to Mysteries, Monsters, and Mayhem.
I'm Shannon Lawrence.
And I'm MB Partlow.
Quick content warning before we get started. This podcast may contain language and disturbing content, so enter at your own risk. Hi.
Greetings.
Greetings, Earthlings.
I need to know if you've heard about the new movie coming out.
The
new Heidi movie.
Heidi? Like the little girl Heidi in the mountains Heidi?
Yes.
Hasn't that been remade a million times? Didn't Shirley Temple do one? Did she do one? No.
So this Heidi is a little bit more modern.
Is it porn?
It's not porn. It's dystopian. Guns. They kill her friend. She learns ninja martial arts and starts killing people.
Nope. Sure haven't.
At some point, Google Heidi and see the trailer. Because I'm trying to remember who plays the new president of Switzerland. Is it set in Switzerland? I think it is. I can't remember. But there's a new president and he's just terrible. He's just a...
You know what? I'm going to rewrite Pippi Longstockings, and it's going to be dystopian, and she's going to be a badass with, like, weaponry and armor and shit.
Pippi is already a badass. Don't get me wrong. I also read Heidi repeatedly as a child, but Pippi... Oh my God, you could put blades in her braids.
There's a lot you can put in her braids, because the whole point is...
Great.
She could have Medusa braids now, and they could each be full of a weapon.
Yeah. Now that we've ruined everyone's childhood.
Let's talk Winnie the Pooh next. Oh wait, they already made a horror movie of it.
They did. Did you watch it?
I have not. I don't even know where it...
I'm not going to, because it does not look like my style of movie.
Oh, I will probably have to, because I need to see the redonk.
Yes. It looks like an over-the-top slasher.
I mean, I watched Cocaine Bear.
Okay, I do want to watch Cocaine Bear. Well,
it's entertaining.
What can I say? I watched Svengoolie, which is B-movie extraordinaire, so...
And it has some creative kills.
Last night was... I can't remember what the movie was called. The Creature with Two Heads. And it was made in the 70s because it's this doctor who's dying. So he's done this experiment on a gorilla where they add another head and then they wait X number of days for it to, be healthy. And then they amputate the original head and realign the spine so that, and once they prove they can do it on a gorilla, of course they can do it on him. Well, his health takes a rapid downturn, and they have to find somebody immediately. It's like, we have hours. Find someone. So they go to the prison system and say, they go to death row. It's so funny because the representation of death row is like, they're all in like Mayberry, this line of jail cells. And this guy comes out with a bullhorn. We have an announcement from the warden. If anybody wants to donate their body to science, you'll get to live for an extra 30 days. You'll still die after 30 days, but you can donate your body to science and get those extra 30 days. So it's already been established that this dying doctor is a huge racist. He hires this doctor sight unseen, and the poor guy gets there, and he's a black man, and he keeps saying, "You people." And it's like, okay, it could have been verbally a lot worse. So the body that the actor who's playing the character that's on death row is Rosie Greer. He's a giant of a man. He's a black football player, former football player. So the guy, basically this scientist wakes up with his little gray head attached to Rosie Greer, and it's right next to Rosie Greer's head. It's kind of amusing.
Huh. That just made me think about last week's Joe Bob, because they played a blaxploitation film.
Ooh, which one?
Called Mothers. Muthers.
Oh.
Where they're basically pirates. It's 3 black women? Two. One of them was one of the Bond girls. Diamonds Are Forever. And I just forgot her name. But anyway, and one was a beauty queen. They're pirates. And then there's this complicated thing where they go to rescue one of their sister, like one of one of the women, her sister, has been
Okay.
taken. And it was filmed in the Philippines, I believe, because there was a period of time where it was super cheap to film in the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
And they would let you have the area for free. And you had woods and you had all this. And then it was super cheap, like to hire extras from the locals. And the leader of the country at that time would let you use his helicopters and stuff because he just wanted to be like he wanted the movies to be there, and he was a big fan of Hollywood and stuff like that. So super cheap to go there. So everything was filmed there for a while. So of course I was sitting there and I was like, well, where's Pamela Grier? I thought Pam Grier was in like all of these movies like this. And so that just made me think of that because I was like, guess she's not. I thought I was going to see some Pam Grier. But it was an interesting yet confusing movie where the arcs were not all tied up. Like, okay. And he said when he introduced it, Joe Bob was like, tonight I'm having junk food and I'm not going to apologize for it. Because Babadook played before that, and my God, everybody either loves or hates Babadook, so I knew those combos were going to happen. But anyway, you talking about that movie made me think about the fact that the bad scientists and acting too quickly and then finding out the consequences afterwards. I wonder if these things came out of the same era that resulted in we must have X amount of study and all of experimentation before we can do this, before human trials laws came. And that makes me want to look it up and see if some crazy shit happened then.
Possibly.
Because if it spurned A, these laws, and B, these laws that bite you in the ass if you have, say, I don't know, ALS that usually kills you within 2 years. But be all these movies and books and stuff that are the same mentality. Like, they're like, listen, science could be bad, okay? With great power.
Yes.
With great mind power.
It was interesting because this guy was set up. It's making me think might give credence to that theory. Because it was set up that this guy, the ill doctor, the racist doctor, had his own, what's the word when you, not amputate, the opposite of amputation.
You sew things on?
Yeah. Transplant.
Oh.
I'm like, there's going to be a big pause.
Right? Not really, because I can edit it out.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is one of those spots where you're going to go, oh, look, MB was having a little a little tiny aneurysm right there. He had his own transplant clinic, and he was like leading the field, but he was very specifically not attached to a hospital, and it was all private because he actually did the experimentation on gorillas in the basement of his home. So when they were ready to do the transplant of his head onto Rosie Greer's body, they showed the people coming into his basement, and they had like industrial tubs of disinfectant, and they're scrubbing down the floors and the walls, and they're putting sterile drapes over the whole room. So it was very much outside of, and I bet they had to make that point, that this was outside of the normal medical field.
It's the thing where, like, after he does his transplant, then something goes wrong with the gorilla, because that's often the trope where they're like, oh shit, look, it's going wrong now.
So what I thought that was going to happen. Then I thought, because Rosie Greer escapes and connects with his girlfriend, and the black doctor ends up going with them, and he believes him that he's not really a murderer. So what I thought was going to happen was either something was going to go horribly wrong with the ape, which it didn't, or they go back to his house to take the doctor's head off. And I thought they were going to put the head on the ape, on the gorilla, the doctor's head. I thought that would have been very fitting. But what happens is you hear his voice weakly calling out, and they go down into the basement. And of course, Rosie Greer and his girlfriend and the other doctor have already fled. And the head is just sitting on like a medical tray with all these tubes attached to it, running to like the heart-lung machine. And I'm like, but he couldn't really talk if he was just a head. I know. Because the whole rest of the movie was believable. It was full of, there's a scene, oh my God, it was hilarious, where they come across this dirt bike rally, so they steal a dirt bike, and they're just going around the course. I'm like, my dude, drive off into the fucking sunset. And then, so after they finally drive out of there are like 25 cop cars chasing them across the field, and they're able to defeat all 25 cop cars because police vehicles must drive into small ravines.
Yeah, it's funny because there's so much car training that cops get to be able to do all the evasive maneuvers and stuff like that. But in the movies, they're always the dumbest motherfuckers ever. They drive into each other. They drive off bridges. They drive into ravines.
It was so Dukes of Hazzard level.
Yeah.
So.
All right, well. You ready to start?
I can start. I am ready. I am going to talk about Jack Unterweger. I might be mispronouncing his name, but that's okay. How's this for a resume? Waiter, murderer, journalist, playwright, serial killer.
That sounds like...
Because obviously anyone who can string 3 words together and express themselves well is above reproach and couldn't possibly be a criminal.
It's true.
It is true. I am privileged to know a lot of writers, and I would say on the whole, they aren't any smarter or saner or more law-abiding than the general public.
They're definitely not saner.
Yeah. So, but what they do know how to do is tell a story. But just because you can tell a good story doesn't mean that you're not above breaking the law. So, we're going to look at Johann Jack Unterweger. He was born in August of 1950 in Austria. His father was an American soldier named Jack Becker, I think. I saw that in more than one place, but then I saw an article that said he didn't ever know who his father was. Anyway, his mother met him in Italy. Some sources say that his mother, Teresia, was a sex worker, and others say that she was a barmaid and a waitress. She could very well have been both. What is known is that she was arrested and convicted for fraud while she was pregnant. When she was arrested again in 1953, when Jack would have been 3 years old, he was sent to live with his maternal grandfather, who, I don't know who came up with this expression, who was a rough fellow, who raised his grandson to help him steal farm animals. So, little further digging, rough fellow roughly approximates to abusive alcoholic.
Oh, okay. Rough fellow.
But I was just like, that was the first place I saw it was on Wikipedia, and I'm like, a rough fellow. Like, is it 1960? I'm confused. So Jack was in and out of trouble and jail for much of his youth. Between 1966 and 1974, when he was ages 16 to 24, he mostly worked as a waiter, but he was convicted during those 8 years. He was convicted 16 times for theft, pimping, and finally assault on a sex worker. And they estimate he spent most of those 8 years incarcerated. And those are fairly formative years. Mm-hmm. In 1974, Jack murdered 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer by strangling her with her own bra. So Unterweger and a prostitute named Barbara Schultz kidnapped her, took her to the woods, and tied her up. Jack demanded sex, and she refused. He hit her with a steel pipe and bludgeoned her to death, but then he did strangle her with the bra.
Okay.
The strangulation didn't kill her, but anyway, he
still got his jollies off.
He still got his jollies off. He told the court later that he saw his mother in her eyes, and that's why he killed her. So he was caught, charged with murder, and sentenced to life in prison in 1976. A court psychologist labeled him a sexually sadistic psychopath with narcissistic and histrionic tendencies, prone to fits of rage and anger. He is an incorrigible perpetrator. So while incarcerated, Jack first learned to read, which is something he never picked up, but then he started writing. And he wrote short stories, plays, poems, and an autobiography titled Purgatory, or The Trip to Prison, Report of a Guilty Man. And Jack became the it boy for a certain set of celebrities in Austria. Among the writers, journalists, artists, and politicians who banded together to lobby for his early release was the celebrated poet, author, and artist Günter Grass. A lot of people have heard of him.
Okay.
I think he wrote Steppenwolf.
Okay.
And novelist Elfried Jelinek. Austrian President Rudolf Kirschlager was petitioned in 1985 to pardon and release Jack, but he refused on the grounds that the courts required a minimum of 15 years to be served for a life sentence. But all these famous people are lobbying. He is look at these beautiful things he's written. He is so open and honest and reflective in his work. He is obviously rehabilitated. Yeah, insert laughter there. He was released in May of 1990 when his 15 years had been served. Everyone agreed that this well-spoken man who wrote poetry and spoke his truth in his biography had been rehabilitated and reformed. He was the darling of society and ready to start his new life. For a while, his biography was taught in Austrian schools as an example of how a man can repent for his crimes and turn his life around. And yes, I did throw up in my mouth a little when I read that. He was sought after as a TV commentator on things like criminal rehabilitation. And he worked as a journalist for a public broadcaster. So it turns out some of the crimes he reported on, it turns out later that they were crimes he committed. And you can only, because there were missing women. And you can only imagine he's just fucking laughing himself sick at night. Because he's on TV and everybody is just pandering to this man. What do you think? What could someone who committed this crime be thinking?
Nice.
So.
Sick.
In the 12 months following his release, he killed several women. So the list includes a young woman named Blanka Bakova in Czechoslovakia. That one took a while to connect because it was in a different country. Her body was staged. She was on her back, her legs apart, with stockings knotted around her neck and covered with leaves. 7 more were in Austria. Brunhild Masser was age 39. She was a known prostitute. Her body wasn't found until after the next victim's body was found, and it was beyond yielding many clues at that point. Heidi Hammerer, who was age 31. She was another sex worker who went missing early December and was found a month later. Her body was also staged, and I'm just going to say this is how he staged a lot of them. On the back, legs spread. They weren't all naked, but they always had bare legs, and they were covered with leaves and bracken and usually had a piece of their clothing wrapped around their neck.
Okay.
This one also had a piece of her slip in her mouth. And
like enough to be a gag or just like a little?
It didn't specify.
Okay.
That hadn't killed her. She was strangled with her stockings. Mm-hmm. So, but it could have been a gag. Elfried Schrempf, age 35, reported missing by her parents, who reported to the police that a man had been calling their unlisted number to taunt them about their daughter's profession. Her body was found in another wooded area covered with leaves. The next 4 women disappeared from Vienna in the space of a month. There was Sylvia Zagler, age 23, Sabine Moitzel, age 25, Karen Araglu Sladke, age 25, and Regina Prem, age 32. They had all been strangled with an article of their own clothing. So I will caution you, if anybody looks this up, I don't know if anybody is that motivated. A lot of the clickbait articles about him say that he strangled everyone with their own bra. He did not.
Yeah, it's different.
I mean, he did one, and he may have done more than one, but because it didn't, the further you got into it, it was like, oh, fuck, we fucked up. And they didn't want to give a lot of details.
Gotcha.
Unterweger knew that the police were onto him, so he was able to convince his employer to send him to the U.S., to Los Angeles, where he would study and report on differences in law enforcement, especially in regards to prostitution. He did ride-alongs. He managed to convince some officers to take him on ride-alongs through the red light districts. During this time, 3 sex workers that included Shannon Exley, 35 years old, Irene Rodriguez, who was 33 years old, and Peggy Booth, who was 26 years old, were found beaten, sexually assaulted with tree branches, and strangled with their own garments. So the 3 bodies were found between June 20th and July 10th, which is just a 10-day span.
He really did. Accelerate.
He accelerated, and I can't imagine how he must have dissociated, because he's presenting this persona to the public, to the police.
Clearly he was charismatic.
Yes.
And he had that,
Yes.
I've known those people in person. They're very good at it. And they especially, though, here's the thing. They especially can fool other men with it. Mm-hmm. Which is interesting. Because that's who I've seen. I've seen that in men, and it's really other men that they kind of wrap around their fingers. But who has the power? Mm-hmm. Men, right? And so it works. That's all they need.
So police in Austria rather quickly realized, and one article made a point of saying the police in Austria did not have a problem with prostitution. Not that it didn't exist, but that it was a more...
They didn't have the Puritan view of it?
Yes, there you go. Police in Austria noticed that the prostitutes stopped disappearing the moment Unterweger left the country. Mm. So they began to investigate him, but they had a lot of roadblocks. They had to build practically an unimpeachable case.
Well, he was already very supported.
All the people who rallied around him in the first place were still standing by him. He began publicly criticizing the police for their lack of progress tracking down the killer, accusing them of being desperate enough to even accuse him. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, because you're fucking guilty.
He spun that one right around, didn't he?
He did.
I'm actually impressed that they made that connection that, holy shit, when he's not here, they're not dying.
It was a 70-year-old retired criminologist who said, hey, this whole strangling them with their own clothes, that happened in a case I worked on. It was a fucking retired 70-year-old man who came up with the connection.
Okay.
They did eventually have enough evidence for an arrest. He had come back to Austria. They had enough evidence for an arrest, and he fled again. And I'm trying to remember, I think he fled through France on his way to the U.S. He was eventually captured in Miami, Florida by U.S. Marshals in February of 92. While he was evading police, while he was on the fucking run, he was still in contact with the Austrian media proclaiming his innocence. He had a choice to be tried in the U.S. or tried in Austria. He decided to go back to Austria because they didn't have the death penalty.
Yeah.
So he was extradited back to Austria in May and charged with 11 murders. A jury found him guilty of 9 of the murders. On June 29th, he was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. And that night, he hanged himself in prison using a rope he made from shoelaces and the drawstring from his track pants.
That actually feels karmic, except for he gets out of the punishment.
It was the same knot. It was the same knot he had used when he killed the women. I'm not done yet, because lest you be thinking, oh, those crazy Austrians. Don't. Have you ever heard of Jack Henry Abbott?
Probably.
As soon as I get going, you'll probably remember this. He was just as American as apple pie. He was in prison for forgery, manslaughter for stabbing another inmate to death, and bank robbery, which he committed when he escaped from prison in Colorado.
Of course.
When he began writing. So in 1977, Abbott read that author Norman Mailer was writing about convicted killer Gary Gilmore. Abbott wrote to Mailer, alleging that Gilmore was largely embellishing his experiences. This little bit right here is a quote direct from Wikipedia. And offered to write about his time in prison in order to provide a more factual depiction of life in prison. Mailer agreed and helped him to publish In the Belly of the Beast, a book concerning life in the prison system consisting of Abbott's letters to Mailer. That was just, I was like, there's no way I can rewrite that to be that succinct. So thanks in part to Mailer's efforts, Abbott was paroled in June of 1981, despite prison officials not believing he had been rehabilitated in the least. He went to a halfway house in New York, hung out with Norman Mailer and all of his literary pals. And 6 weeks after his release, he was at a restaurant in Manhattan when he had a disagreement with a waiter named Richard Adon. Outside the restaurant near a dumpster, Abbott stabbed Adon to death. Abbott fled but was captured a few months later. Back in New York City, he was represented by, and somebody else had to have paid for this. This man didn't have any money. He was represented by a big shot lawyer named Ivan Fisher, who normally defended high-dollar, white-collar criminals. Besides Norman Mailer, writer Jerzy Kosinski also endorsed and supported Abbott, who was eventually convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years to life in 1982. He applied for parole in 2001 and was denied. He hanged himself in prison in February of 2002. One positive note from this story, which came up in last week's, aside from his initial advance of $12,500, Abbott did not profit at all from his literary successes. Adon's widow sued for damages and was awarded $7 million, meaning any money from the sale of the book, she received it.
Nice.
And I'm also going to, speaking of writers who were criminals, in a previous episode, which we aired on February 23rd of 2022, we talked about novelist Anne Perry, who as a teenage girl acted with her best friend to murder her mother.
Heavenly Creatures.
What?
Heavenly Creatures.
Yes, the movie Heavenly Creatures.
Yeah.
At that time, Perry's name was Juliette Hulme, Hulme. As an update, because I didn't know this until until yesterday, Perry passed away in April of this year at age 84.
Oh.
I had not.
Wow.
I somehow missed all that. And every article mentioned the fact that she had killed her mother as a teen.
Doesn't go away.
No, and served 5 years for it. My sources for this were True Crime A Day calendar. Gotta love that calendar. Wikipedia, UK crime investigation website, and Murderpedia.
Murderpedia.
So what you got good this week?
I didn't know that I had an automatic out because I'm a writer.
There
I
you
need
go.
to really start using that.
But you got to get somebody famous to back you and be on your side and tell everybody you're the shit. I mean, I tell people you're the shit all the time, but I am not influential in the least.
Oh Lord, I'm working on it.
You are.
Okay, so I'm doing the disappearance of Kremers and Froon, also Europeans. On April 2nd, 2014, two Dutch women, 21-year-old Kris Kremers and 22-year-old Lisanne Froon, disappeared while on a hike in Panama. Body parts were found later along with strange clues that complicated the presumption of events, creating the question of whether they died by accident or something more dastardly. Both women had recently finished studies at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, Lisanne with a degree in psychology, and Kris in art education and cultural social education. But I think that she had not, one of them had not actually graduated yet because they had some more work to do. So it said they completed their studies, but they hadn't graduated.
Oh, so maybe had to submit a thesis or something.
An internship or, thesis, something like that.
Or an exam.
Yeah.
Okay.
Their trip to Panama was to last 6 weeks. They had saved up for months, obviously, to be able to make this trip. During their vacation, they had also intended to do some volunteer work with children. Their plan was basically 1, go on vacation, 2, learn Spanish, 3, do something to help others. That was their thing. Their disappearance occurred about 2 weeks into the trip.
Oh.
So their actual arrival occurred on March 15th. On March 29th, they arrived in Boquete, Cherokee, where they established themselves with a local family hosting them. This family would frequently host people, and it sounds like there were quite a few Dutch people there. So Panama is just where the Dutch go? I don't know. Here's where they had their plans to do work with children. But when they showed up at the school, they were told there was no place for them there. The headmistress was basically like, I decided I didn't have the time to deal with this and find a place for them, even though she had confirmed on the Friday before that they were still on. So they get all the way out there with these arrangements.
That's weird.
And and she said something about, I don't know, they were both like 18, which I've already said their ages. They were a little older than 18.
Mm-hmm.
And I could barely understand a word they said, and they didn't really speak Spanish. And like, she just came across as super cantankerous in her shit. And I'm like, so you were a bitch.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. So they both took it pretty hard. I guess it sounded like Lisanne took it harder. They were texting their parents and calling them every day and updating everybody. And they were pretty disappointed. And they were like, we will find something else to do. We'll find another school, or we are going to do what we came here to do. But in the meantime, they had some free time that they hadn't planned on. On April 1st at around 11 a.m., they said what was supposed to be a brief goodbye to the family and headed out for a hike on the El Pianista Trail, which would take them into the forest near the Baru volcano, which they ultimately were planning on going a different day with a guide to go up this volcano and visit it. They're supposed to have had breakfast with two Dutchmen that they'd run into who were also in the area, and then a taxi did take them to the trailhead and confirmed when he dropped them off. The trail they'd be following, as well as others around it, was well traveled by villagers to get around, so they weren't isolated trails. Though they had been warned not to hike up there alone. It is believed they didn't take any food with them. They each had one bottle of water. This was not meant to be a long thing. That was the hike, on average, was like 3 hours for people to get up there.
Hours.
They ended up doing it in about 2, as confirmed by timestamps and camera and stuff that we're going to go into later, but I'm not going to go into that part specifically. So they did make it up pretty quick, because there was a lot of talk about how one of them was asthmatic and seemed to be struggling, but they made that hike in 2 hours, so they were healthy. They were in good shape. They made quick time. They had an appointment with a guide on April 2nd, the next day, but they didn't show up. The host family ultimately reported them missing, and the parents, who had not received the usual daily texts and got no responses to their texts and calls, arrived in Panama on April 6th. Officials from the Netherlands came out to help in the search with local police, and a reward for information that started at $3,000 ended up going up to $30,000 by the time this was done. The search went on for 10 days, with dogs and everything, but no sign of the women was found during that time.
Ooh.
Then on June 14th, a woman living in the area found a blue backpack wedged against a rock next to a river in Alto Romero, a village not far from Bocate. It was determined to be Lisanne's backpack. Inside were 2 bras, and I was like, hell yeah, if I'm stuck out there in the wild, I'm taking off the bra and it's going in the backpack. 2 pairs of sunglasses, $83 in cash. They said it was in US dollars, which I'm confused about, because they were from the Netherlands and they're in Panama. But everywhere I found, so I don't know if they were saying this is the equivalent and it was maybe in local money or what. But it was $83 worth of in US. Lisanne's passport, a Canon PowerShot camera belonging to Lisanne, a water bottle, and both their phones. The phones were dead. There was no food, and there were no food wrappers, possibly confirming they hadn't brought food at all, like I said. So, but they did have like a couple candy wrappers. That's all they found. So it's like they had some little treats, but no food. Though a small bit of sand was inside the backpack, nothing appeared to be really water damaged. But supposedly this backpack had traveled quite a long distance and was wedged near the river, and it was assumed it had come down the water. So people were trying to figure out how was everything in it not waterlogged.
Right.
We're talking miles. Using the phones and cameras, a portion of their track could be traced, though additional questions were also raised from these. There's some weird things. At 4:39 p.m., Kris dialed 112, the international emergency number that is also used in the Netherlands. At 4:51 p.m., Lisanne also tried 112. No further calls were made on April 1st. So that is the day they set on this hike. Before nightfall, they're trying to call an emergency number. Something has happened. On April 2nd, they both tried again, starting at 6:58 a.m. At 10:52 a.m., Lisanne tried both 112 and 911. And 911, by the way, is also used in Panama. That is the local number. At 1:50 p.m., Lisanne turned on her phone to look for a signal, but no signal was received. The same thing happened at 4:19. This is all trackable from the inside the phone. On April 3rd, one 911 attempt was made at 9:32 a.m. From then on, Kris checked the signal on her iPhone multiple times, where she plugged in her PIN code. I put this out for a reason, which would go on until 10:50 a.m. on April 5th. Then at 1:37 p.m. on the 5th, someone attempted to get into the iPhone but did not have the PIN or did not enter the PIN. There were attempts through April 11th to turn on the phone. The PIN was never entered again. There were swipes. There were intentional swipes. They said you could tell the difference between like it being turned on because it's in your pocket versus a finger swipe.
Okay.
But No, the pin was never entered, or it was misentered.
Okay, just so I can get this clear in my head. What date were these?
April 1st was when they took off.
Right, but what date were these non-pin attempts to get in?
Starting April 5th.
And her parents got there when?
6th.
Okay.
Lisanne's Galaxy died after attempt to check for a signal that involved her pin at 5 p.m. on the 4th. So that one was out of commission early, but the iPhone was still being used. Interestingly, though, there were no further attempts made on Kris's phone after April 11th. There was still 22% battery remaining at that time. And on that day, that April 11th swipe, without a pin entry, the phone was left. It had been powered on at that point because it had been turned off before that. That's how this battery was being conserved for so long. It was on for like an hour and 5 minutes or something like that. And then it was turned off for the last time, and it had 22% battery at that time. So it did not die. The swipes did not stop because it was dead. It's just one of the little bits of information that's kind of weird and creates a question. Switching to the Canon camera now. The beginning of their hike on April 1st shows Lisanne taking photos here and there of the hike. I'm going to post some of them, including photos of both of them. They were standing at the overlook, which was their ultimate destination, and it looks down at the Continental Divide. So there's conjecture that perhaps they reached that point because they did it ahead of time, since they got there pretty early. They then followed a trail that would take them down to the Continental Divide, probably with the intention of them turning around because they needed to be back before dark. And again, they hadn't taken any food. That's why I made such a point of saying that. They had 1 bottle of water each. They had no changes of clothes. They were in shorts and tank tops. They weren't out there to go camping. There was no camping gear. They weren't there to go on a 12-hour hike. So it also raised the question of, did they willingly continue forward, or was there some reason they felt they had to keep going that way? It was raised that perhaps they thought there was some sort of loop that would take them back to the village, but multiple people said they told them that there was no loop and they would have to turn back at the overlook to get back.
And
including
they're not
that
stupid.
bitchy headmistress. And these girls were not stupid. They were bright girls. Interestingly, there's a source I had. There were 2 really good sources that were basically blogs, but they had done deep dives. And one was a Dutch woman, and she was pointing out the very Dutch things. The Danish do not call 911 or 211, whatever. They do not call the police unless there is a very good reason. Unlike Americans who will call 911 and say, there's a raccoon in my backyard.
Right.
This is not a thing that happens in the Netherlands.
Okay.
I said Danish, isn't that Denmark? Anyway, the Dutch do not do this. Most people agree they would have intended to head back. So it's just, they're like, we talked to them about that. Like the host family, like everybody is like, no, they knew what they were doing. Also, later on, they would look at their computers and they had clearly already researched this trail and knew what they were doing. Oh. And the thing is that after you reach that overlook, a lot of people said, don't go past it. This is the safe trip. After this, it gets more rugged. The trails are less marked. There's also a question on some of the pictures where they're not smiling anymore. And they're in some weird looking situations and they're not posing the cute way they were before. So like they're just standing there like, was somebody else with them? Was somebody else making them go do things? They don't know. There's nothing really that points to that. April 8th, a series of photos simply called The Night Photos were taken between 1 and 4 a.m. about. A lot of study has been done on these photos, though not all of them appear to have been released publicly. The police and the families have stated that the ones not released are just black. Those studying the photos have determined they were all taken from the same general area. In fact, I found there was a map basically that showed, like, put them together into almost a collage to show the direction and that it was all the same area. It's pitch black, but the flash was being used. There's evidence of a rock face, a ravine, trees, and a river. It's raining in many of the photos. There's also a photo of a mirror on a rock and one of a twig. And there's pieces of paper around it. And there's the backpack handle. And I will post that picture. It's very vague looking. But people have zoomed in. They have shown Thrifty on one of the pieces of paper, which was like a rental thing or something that they were able to pull up like paper from this company and show that it looked like it might be from that. There were 2 plastic bags on a rock that were originally thought to be balloons, but were later identified as red bags that were used in nearby towns. One photo strangely shows what appears to be the back of Kris's head. She had strawberry blonde hair and Lisanne had blonde hair, so it's clearly Kris's head
Mm-hmm.
And they're in Panama, so there's not going to be some other person randomly wandered up with strawberry blonde hair wherever they were. Aside from a possible leaf in the hair, there are no signs of injury. Her hair's a little bit messy, I guess, but it's not matted. It's not filthy. And that's a week into them having been out there.
Huh.
Yes. So that's the only one that has like one of them or a human in it in these night photos. There's also a missing photo between the last daylight photo, a photo or video, by the way, because it could take video, and the first night photo. Experts have said this is impossible unless a camera is connected to a computer. Because again, you delete it off of the camera. It's not actually gone unless you go to a computer and remove it. But it was completely gone. Obviously, they didn't have a computer with them. So otherwise, the photo should have been there. So there's a lot of talk about things being tampered with, including the bag before they were turned in.
Right.
So this is just another question raised. There's also commentary on maybe these photos were photoshopped in some way, like the day photos. Who knows? I looked at them. I didn't. I was like, I don't see a clear sign. They were like, her body's distorted. I was like, she's standing in a... Leave her alone. She's skinny. Why 7 days into their disappearance were 90 photos taken in the middle of the night?
90?
Yeah, there's like 98 or something like
Holy
that. It's the
shit.
final count. Some have theorized they were trying to scare off an animal, but it's thought that at least one photo would have probably captured said animal. And somebody did make a list of the animals there, and though they have like leopard or jaguars and stuff like that, the ones that are there are not known to attack humans. And technically, if they were where they were supposed to be, if one of them had been injured, the other one could have followed the path back and found somebody.
Right.
Because again, it wasn't isolated at that point. The same is said of them trying to dissuade perhaps a person who's harassing them. But again, there should have been at least one photo that captures a portion of that person. One of the more likely theories that they heard voices or saw lights in the distance, possibly one of search parties, because they were being searched for at that time. Or, say, lights in a villager's home or something like that lived out there in the boonies. And they were attempting to signal them in the hopes that they would be rescued. But they were like, well, why weren't they just screaming? Because the voices would carry farther than a camera flash.
Yeah.
So who knows? There's also the possibility the flash was used to light the area for them to get around or make sure they weren't too close to the water. I was like, the iPhone still had battery and it has a flashlight on it. I assume it did it in the 2014. But the argument against that is that it lasted several hours. I mean, 3 hours of running, and some of them click, 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 moved around. Some of them looking up. So very strange.
It doesn't make any sense.
So then somebody was like, well, what if someone had found their belongings or the bodies or something like that, and thus the picture of the back? But why then, if you're fucking around, do you not take a picture of the bodies themselves, not the back of somebody's head?
Yeah.
And what if it was the killer fucking around? Well, wouldn't they take pictures of the people?
If they were going to take pictures, I would think
and then keep the camera?
Yeah.
So just none of it.
It doesn't make sense.
Makes sense. So there's conjecture that the mirror on the rock, it was just a little round mirror, were they trying to signal during the day? Is that a thing where they're like trying to shine light because there were rescue planes? There weren't rescue planes at night, clearly. But they did search by plane over some of these areas. And so had they tried to signal with the mirror and that's why it's out? Nobody knows. After the backpack was turned in, the searchers focused around the Culebra, or Snake River, near where the backpack was found, and upstream. This led to more discoveries. The first was the discovery of Kris's jean shorts on top of a rock on the other side of the river from where the backpack had been found. It's directly across. It's not a super wide river. And a few kilometers away. This was it until 2 months later when a hiking boot with a foot still inside was discovered severed at the ankle. This was found to be Lisanne's foot.
Oh.
Half of Kris's pelvic bone was discovered also close to where the backpack had been found. Here's the thing about pelvic bones. They don't break like that, especially not in a 20-something. No. Those bones are very strong. In fact, when they find bodies, the entire pelvis is often intact, right? The continued search ultimately turned up over 30 bones scattered along the riverbank. DNA testing confirmed some of these human bones belonged to both missing women, but only 2 bones, including the aforementioned pelvic bone, belonged to Kris. The other bone was her lower rib. Oddly, the ones belonging to Lisanne seem to have decomposed at a normal rate, with traces of skin still attached to them, as well as some connective tissues, that's how it should have been at that point in time. But Kris's looked bleached and had no skin or connective tissue still attached. Not only would it be hard to break that pelvis, like I said, but there should have been some manner of connective tissue remaining where it was broken. Even more interesting, the women's bones were at different stages of decomposition from each other, though they were found in the same area. There are 5 total stages: fresh, bloat, active decomp, advanced decomp, and skeletal decay. Kris's bones were in the 4th stage of decomposition, while Lisanne's were somewhere between the 1st and 2nd stage, which is where they should have been. Forensic experts have suggested her remains were refrigerated or cooled at some point.
Ew.
Finally, in August 2014, and there were still like creatures on the one, like the insect life, and not on the other one. And there should have been. Finally, in August 2014, a piece of skin was found that had not decomposed much. It kept saying, like, lump of skin. And I'm like, somebody just found a lump of skin. I find that so much more disturbing than happening across, I think, even a whole body, maybe. But a skeleton, certainly. And, like, there's just skin. Like, who looked at that and went, I bet that's human skin. Anyway, it had not decomposed that much. It certainly didn't match the time frame. DNA testing showed this was Lisanne's skin. It was found near a femur and tibia, also thought to be hers, and was like curled, but that's what skin does. Interestingly, there's going to be some weird fucked up government. It's Panama. Let's just remember that. Government shit. One of the blog people that, and I will have her credit at the end, blog people that I read through a lot of her stuff, the woman who was also Dutch, she had taken screenshots of a bunch of things. And so she had a record that at some point they changed that. And suddenly it was saying, nope, that was cow skin the whole time. That wasn't anything. But she had where they screenshot it where they had originally said it had been DNA tested and proven to be hers. So there are a lot of things that changed later.
Interesting.
The Culebra River flows north and changes elevation around the continental divide. They were hiking at a higher elevation. It looked like everything was in meters. So when I just kind of loosely did it basically their variance was 4,000 to 6,000 or just above 6,000. I think there might have been a part a little higher than that, feet. The river is curvy, rocky, shallow, and slow outside the rainiest times of the year, and April is not a heavy rain period, but leading in the next few weeks it becomes. And that's when flash floods can occur and the river can swell and speed up. The high temperatures in the area reached about 68 degrees during the time the women were thought to be alive. Again, it's spring.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are thinking Panama and tropical and rainforest and stuff. It was not, in fact, rainforest. It was just woods.
Okay.
And that's pretty normal spring temperature, 68 degrees for the high in April. As far as Kris's bleached bones, phosphorus was found on the bones, but not Lisanne's. There was no naturally occurring phosphorus in the area, so forensic experts believe Kris's bones were treated with a combination of phosphorus and lime. These two are used in conjunction in farming in fertilizer. And they are very frequently used for this sort of thing as well, including by, say, cartels, which are in the area. And I'll talk about that a bit more, too. In addition, the bones were found at a distance that would have required a 14-hour hike from where they last had those pictures, and a crossing of 2 rivers from where they were last known to be. Again, they hadn't set out with a change of clothes, camping gear, food, yada, yada. There's no way they would have decided to go on a 14-hour hike involving camping out when they only had shorts and tank tops in the early spring. I didn't see what the temperatures dropped to at night, but we know those temperatures at an elevation like that. That's our elevation.
Yeah, they drop.
We're at about 6,200. My house, maybe 6,400. They drop. A forensic anthropologist examined the bones and found that there were no scratches, no minute scratches. And that means that the bones could not have been dragged through the river. Okay. Because bones are heavy. Right. They will sink, unlike the body tissues and fat, and they will scrape along those rocks at the bottom. Otherwise, their presumption would have been that they had died close to the river, and then flooding had happened later, and the bodies had been picked up and moved. But they still would have had to be gotten down to that river, and then, anyway, swept down and distributed. But bones are dense. It just doesn't make any sense. There should also have been some sort of rounding or smoothing from that water and from those rocks, but there was nothing like that either. This also says something about predation. There were no tooth or claw marks on the bones, showing that predators likely weren't responsible for the scattering of the bones. Basically, while the police stipulated the women must have had an accident and ended up in the river, the forensic data doesn't support this. Like the police were saying one thing, and then forensic anthropologists and criminologists were saying something different. The break of the pelvis would have been extremely hard to do. As one forensic expert said, the only two options were catastrophic physical damage or a human acting upon the bones. They would have had to fall hundreds upon hundreds of feet to break the pelvic bone the way it did. As we so often see, the forensic experts have also said the investigation was mishandled. There was no chain of custody on the remains, and other aspects of evidence collection were done improperly. Fingerprints were found in the backpack and items inside, but no fingerprint comparisons or checks were done. No fingerprints or DNA were taken from those who had come in contact with the bag, including the woman who found it. DNA was found and identified as male and female, including multiple on their bras. But I'm like, well, a lot of people, maybe you don't know this, folks, bras don't get washed every day.
No.
Nope. So, and that wasn't tested or necessarily processed in any way. When it was found that the bones revealed 3 additional bodies, those human bones they found, those 30-something, it was like 33 bones or something specifically, belonged to 3 other people, including a child. The government abruptly shut down the investigation, said it had been an accidental death. Even more intriguing, several persons of interest and investigators disappeared or suffered deaths in the form of car accidents and drownings, but I was seeing people referring to that like we all knew what they were talking about, because people have very religious, like web sleuths have gone crazy over this one. But like I couldn't actually find articles about that said it, so take that with a grain of salt, because I don't know what they were talking about. And I did some really deep dives into these two. There's so much I didn't put in here about specifics. Somebody who sat there with cameras and tried to create the conditions showing up in the pictures to test what this might have been, and looking into they had all of the photos and breakdowns of what the photos were and just stuff like that. They broke down the cell phones and where they were located. Somebody went in and pulled up all of the weather for that time. There is a website that you can look up past weather, rainfall, when the flash flooding occurred at that time. And I read all this shit like, holy shit. And I was like, I can't put all that in there. Nobody cares.
Oh, God, their parents must have been devastated.
Yes. And a female journalist took a crew out and has stated that she met with threats for the first time in her life, despite the fact she had done journalistic cases such as investigating Mexican cartels. And this was where her life got threatened.
Huh.
Yes. When journalists, and she does have a podcast, but I didn't write down what it was because I was a little annoyed that she wrote this vague article just to get you to go. I was like, you're a journalist. Like, put something in here. When journalists started looking into it, they discovered there were more than 50 missing women and girls in a 40-mile corridor in the area. These being mostly local disappearances, they didn't make the news. These women did because they were tourists who had families willing to raise a fuss. Femicide is rampant in the area. I've talked about it in Mexico. It's not just confined to Mexico, and is considered a shadow pandemic there. There are also active cartels and gangs in the area. And again, those gangs have been known to use fertilizer. And the thing is, if it's left in there long enough, that combination with the lime will eat away the bones too. So they felt there had been an interruption for some reason. They needed to get rid of the bones early if this happened. And they did completely, that person who did the deep dive into everything had a whole section on how bones can be bleached, and that it would have been impossible for this pelvic bone to be bleached to that extent in the sun in the time it was there, and that it looked different. They had a picture of a sun bleached pelvis versus this pelvis that was kind of an olive color at that point, but very cleaned off of things. In short, evidence and surrounding issues indicate these women did not meet with an accident, but most likely a human being or several, but they really can't piece together anything that matches up with the 911 attempts and the photo shots. Somebody was like, well, what if they were captive at the point where they were taking the night photos and they hadn't taken away the the camera, but just their phones. But no, because then, well, that could have been because then they were swiping. That means that they had their phones until the 5th because they were entering their PINs.
Right.
You know, like if somebody forced you to enter your PIN, they would have it, or they'd just keep forcing you to enter your PIN. So nothing adds up. In short, like no conspiracy theory. Hurt. Yes. Which is why this is such a big deal still. It appears both bodies were processed in some way, like the one kept in a fridge though, and the other one with the bones actually cleaned. And there was a whole bunch about Lisanne's body being disarticulated, taken apart. Like the river at that point in time and the way it was found and stuff like that, it typically, unless the bones were already exposed in some way, the skin would have held it together more. Like the body would not have disarticulated, would not have fallen off into little pieces in the river as a fresh body.
Right.
Basically is the gist of that. It can take a really long time for a body to decompose to the point where it is skeletal.
Yeah.
Longer than a couple months.
And it's not going to...
It's like a year.
Yeah. And it's not just going to fall apart. The bones aren't going to just break off.
So that was also very unusual. And also they never found like skulls. They never found rib cages. They found one rib. They didn't except for one femur and tibia, and they were pieces.
Yeah.
Because I saw the one and again there was no rounding because they have the picture of like the end of the femur, that knob or whatever, and it's not worn down at all. And it just makes no sense. They did not find all they found were these smaller
random bones.
And they're like, so the other ones have to be somewhere. The government authorities refused to look into it further. And in fact, both governments, the Netherlands and Panama, have stated it's an accident. One of the families did sue over the botched investigation, though the other one accepted that it was an accident. And that might have been a self-preservation, like, Definitely. Okay, it was an accident and I am moving on. And the other family said, no, I'm suing over this. This doesn't make any sense that this is an accident. They weren't stupid. If they'd fallen at the base of the overlook, they'd be at the overlook. The river wasn't there.
Yeah.
So it's not like they could have fallen down into the river. And yet they were 14 hours away. I don't know for some reason I kept referring to in hours. I never found a kilometer or mile measurement of how far that was. But that's a distance, 14 hours.
Yeah.
Because you can go miles in... Just the 2 hours that they went were probably several miles, right? Like, anyway, nor have they looked into many of the other missing women in the area. So sources, the first two I'm going to mention, these are the two that are really interesting. If you want to look up more about this, these are the ones that did deep dives of different cases, or different ways. So Kouda Kaas, Koudakaas, and that's .blogspot.com, but that means cold case.
Okay.
That is the Dutch woman who has basically really well compiled the facts up to this point. And unfortunately, that was one of the last places I found after being hooked on this next one that I'll mention. But she puts things together really well and also brings the culture into it about, well, they wouldn't do this because here's the culture, and that is interesting because that does play a part. And the other one was a blog series, and that is imperfectplan.com. And he's the one who does I believe it's a male, does these really, really deep dives and breaks down all these pieces, did so much research, looked into how to break down bodies, looked into how decomposition works and the let and the time periods, looked into rainfall, looked into all of that, the weather, the temperatures, even looked because they were found on the other side of the continental divide. And some of the bones were apparently found upstream from the back, there's all sorts of weird shit like this.
It makes no sense at all.
And they did photo things to test it out and see how would we make this look like? Because one of the things was like, did she take a picture of the own back of her head to look for an injury? Well, there was no injury. There's no blood. There's none of that, even though some sources claim there were. I looked at the picture. There's no blood. And so that was disproven eventually. So Imperfect Plan is really interesting. And this is a person who lives, I don't know if they live in Panama, but they live somewhere in that general area and went to Panama to follow the path. One set of parents actually had guides and people go with them, and they followed the path to test. And there are videos and trackings of that available online. A lot of that is on that Cold Case or Kodakos website too, where they have talk show videos from the family that went on there. So those two, that's what I'm recommending to you. They had some really great information. I wish I'd found those ones before the other sources because I sunk way too much time into it after that and just couldn't read everything that both of those two had. So there's good shit there, and I want to give them due credit. I also looked at MSNBC, all that's interesting in Wikipedia, and of course that's probably like reverse order from where I started until I got to the good shit. So definitely look those up. And if you're interested and want to see just the bizarreness of it. And yes, it's been officially declared accidental death. It just doesn't make any sense.
No.
It doesn't, the time frames don't align, the distances don't align.
What do you think happened?
So many thoughts and theories. It's just strange.
It is.
But it really does seem like somebody was trying to get into their phones afterwards, because unless they were, one of the things that was thrown out was, well, maybe they were hallucinating at that point. But they had, and I think the water bottle was full, which means they only drank one water bottle. And to be alive that long, I'm like, were they being given water? Were they drinking? Because that'll kill you faster. Like, not having food is one thing, but not having water, we all know that kills you much faster than not having food.
Yes.
But so were they near this river getting water? Were they drinking water from the river? That could be. I'm surprised they wouldn't drink the other water bottle first. What stopped them from doing that? So again, it seems like somebody's providing them water if they're captive.
I was going to say, unless someone stole their backpack, but that makes no sense because the phones and the camera were in the backpack.
And the story on where the backpack was found seemed to change multiple times from the woman who brought it in. And then there was like another guy involved. There was a third party. I decided not to go into that because it got really complicated. And again, that needs to be somebody's deep dive. But they don't even know did she find it? It was like in a rice paddy. Next to all of this. But then they said they never went there. For whatever reason they went there, but it was 2 hours from their home. And then there's some guide. And so, there's a lot of question about things being tampered with. If this backpack was did it actually go down the river?
Or did somebody
was
put
it placed there? But it did seem to have some, there was a little bit of dirt on it. There was a little bit of sand in it. The phones might have had a little bit of water damp, but they still turned, they were still, SD card and everything was still perfectly usable. And there's just some really bizarre things, and it seems like things being buried, and it's Panama, and the fact that there are so many femicides in the area, and the fact that there are so many missing women that aren't even being acknowledged, that journalists had to bring up, not the investigators. The main investigator fucked everything up, and then she was removed within 2 months, but then the new one wasn't any better. And so there's so much more to this case than we could possibly cover. That's why there's a whole podcast that's a series on this. Wow. By a journalist that went into that area, was from that area originally.
I was going to say, and we, from a distance, can't ever...
No. So it's intriguing, but could it have been accidental and just some things came together? Maybe if they went past that point, but how much farther would they have gone? They weren't stupid. They were brand new in that area. Why would they go without anything when they had so carefully researched it? They showed on their computers, they did so much research. They knew where to go on the trail and where not to go on the trail. They just didn't seem like the type.
Yeah.
To do something that reckless and stupid. They weren't people who did that type of thing.
Bizarre.
And they had goals and they had things they wanted to do there. They weren't fucking off.
No.
So, they had spent 2 weeks at there's pictures of them. They're at the beach and they're having so much fun and they had a great time. And there were other Dutch folks there that they got to hang out with. And the school they were going to work at actually was Dutch based or Dutch origin or something like that. So again, it did seem like an area with a Dutch concentration of some sort, which happens. It happens.
It's like the Hawaiians in
So it really does seem
Vegas.
to me like something went very wrong, there was somebody else involved.
It had to have been human intervention. It can't just be a random accident.
And their phones so nicely placed in the backpack. And
that's the part that, I mean, it has to have been human intervention, but then why give the backpack back?
Unless they didn't. Maybe they did. Maybe that other party had the backpack, but then, and maybe they took it away with them. And then there was a whole series of people that did the stupid, well, let's turn it in so that we release ourselves from guilt. But I never saw that those people were investigated at all.
Yeah.
The 3 that were brought into it with that. And I was like, persons of interest. I couldn't find who the persons of interest were. So, yeah, there's some weird shit that happened with this. And even if it was an accident, I think some cover-up shit was done because they didn't want to have that guilt brought down on them then or something. So, anyway, super intriguing case.
That is.
That I hadn't heard of before and just happened to pop up on one of my weird things that have happened deals. And I was like, okay.
Weird shit that happened this week.
Yeah. It's like disappearances that have so many weird things around them. Because otherwise, if all that didn't exist, sure, it'd be totally believable that something stupid happened. But they were so far away from where they started. And the different levels of decomp and fascinating. So look up Imperfect Plan and Cold Case. Kodakas. And check it out. All right. That's it. Second episode of our 6th season.
Yes.
Woot woot.
Woot woot.
Thank you for listening. Check us out on buymeacoffee.com/mayhem if you would like to support the podcast.
And we will talk to you about something fascinating next week.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Mysteries, Monsters, and Mayhem.
Find us on Facebook and Instagram or at our website, mysteriesmonstersmayhem.com.
Please like, rate, and review, follow, and share wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.
Thank you for listening and supporting our podcast. We'll be back next week with more shenanigans.